Why the West fears Julius Malema, full breakdown. Julius Malema, the firebrand leader of South Africa's economic freedom fighters, is a political enigma. Admired by many for his populist stance on economic justice, land reform, and anti-colonial rhetoric, he also raises alarm bells among Western governments, investors, and think tanks. But what exactly is it about Malema that concerns the West? In this in-depth report, WorldWire News explores the roots of this unease, its geopolitical implications, and what it means for South Africa and the broader African continent. 1. Radical economic policies, a threat to Western interests. At the heart of Western apprehension lies Malema's economic agenda, which directly challenges neoliberal orthodoxy. The EFF's policy platform advocates nationalization of mines, banks, and strategic sectors. Expropriation of land without compensation. Universal basic services funded through state control of resources. To Western investors and global financial institutions, these policies signal a potential disruption of market-based frameworks and threaten the profitability of multinationals operating in South Africa. Western concern: if implemented, such policies could trigger capital flight, disrupt supply chains, especially in the mineral sector, and create a precedent for other African nations to follow suit. 2. Pan-African rhetoric and anti-Western sentiment. Malema's fiery speeches often include unapologetic anti-imperialist and anti-colonial narratives. He consistently challenges the legacies of Western dominance in Africa and accuses global powers of propping up corrupt African elites, exploiting Africa's natural resources, undermining African sovereignty through soft power and aid dependence. His unapologetic support for Pan-African unity, economic independence, and African self-determination appeals to a younger generation of African leaders and thinkers, but simultaneously places him at odds with the geopolitical interests of countries like the US, UK, and France. Western concern: Malema's ideology could spark a continental shift in alliances, reducing Western influence while increasing ties to alternative powers like China, Russia, and BRICS. 3. Foreign policy views that challenge the West. Malema has repeatedly expressed support for governments and leaders considered pariahs by the West, including Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro, Zimbabwe's ZANU-PF leadership, Russia's geopolitical stance against NATO expansion, his calls for African nations to pull out of the International Criminal Court, ICC, and resist what he calls Western legal imperialism, create friction with institutions that rely on African cooperation. Western concern: Malema's foreign policy positions could align South Africa away from Western consensus, particularly on international sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the war in Ukraine. 4. Mass mobilization and populist appeal. What truly sets Malema apart is his ability to mobilize large swaths of the South African population, particularly the youth and disenfranchised. His rallies are electrifying, his social media presence formidable, and his rhetoric tailored to invoke emotion, history, and identity. He taps into legitimate grievances: unemployment, inequality, and historical land dispossession, turning them into political capital. Western concern: a populist surge led by Malema could reshape South Africa's political structure, undermining the more pro-Western African National Congress, ANC, and accelerating a shift away from democratic norms toward a more centralized, authoritarian populism. 5. Land reform, the flashpoint issue. Malema's most controversial position is arguably his push for land expropriation without compensation. While framed as a necessary correction of historical injustice, this policy strikes fear in Western circles. It mirrors the Zimbabwean land reform crisis, which led to economic collapse and international sanctions. It threatens foreign-owned agricultural and commercial land interests. It introduces legal uncertainty that could chill future foreign direct investment, FDI. Western concern: If South Africa follows Zimbabwe's trajectory, it could destabilize one of the continent's most important economies and a key Western trading partner. 6. The bigger picture: a shift in Africa's global alignment. The fear is not just about Malema the man but what he represents. In an era where many African nations are reconsidering their post-independence relationships with the West, Malema's ideology could become the blueprint for a new wave of anti-Western populism across the continent. His rise coincides with broader continental trends: disillusionment with Western aid and diplomacy, increased Chinese and Russian economic footprints, a growing call for African solutions to African problems. Final thoughts: should the West be worried? Yes and no. Malema's growing popularity and radical platform are undeniable signs of a frustrated electorate seeking justice, reform, and sovereignty. For the West, ignoring these concerns or reacting with heavy-handed tactics would be a strategic misstep. Engagement, not isolation, is key. However, if Malema ascends to power without institutional checks, and if his policies are implemented without pragmatism, South Africa could face economic turbulence, diplomatic isolation, and institutional erosion, a scenario the West fears deeply. Conclusion: the fork in the road. Julius Malema embodies both the promise and peril of a post-colonial African future: bold, defiant, and unpredictable. Whether he becomes a revolutionary reformer or a destabilizing demagogue depends on how he navigates power and how the West chooses to respond.